Understanding China has never been more important and more difficult. Takshashila's latest executive capsule course, Watching China, is an all virtual course that will help you decode China's politics and policies. Learn about the party state structure, ideology, and policy drivers. Master the language of Communist Party discourse and open source research. The course is perfect for professionals, journalists, students, or anyone curious about the Asian giant. Sign up now on the link in the description to start understanding China like never before.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy by the Takshashila Institution, the podcast where we break down pivotal moments in global politics and their ripple effects across the international stage. In this episode, we delve into the historic second presidential inauguration of Donald J. Trump and his promise of ushering in a quote-unquote golden age for America, his return to the Oval Office at a time where US-China contestation is intensifying, and his impulsive executive orders, which have obvious implications for India and Indians' interests vis-a-vis the American dream. As the world tuned in to witness his return on what was literally a very cold day in Washington, D.C., questions loomed and continue to loom about how his administration would navigate pressing issues ahead. We saw him be a part of the lofty halls of Davos, where the world's elite gathered to debate economic priorities, and his cabinet created strategic corridors for discussions with the Quad foreign ministers meeting. And in this regard, it is safe to say that Trump's second term has, just in its first 5 days, already kicked off the process of reshaping the geopolitical landscape. In this episode, I have Manoj Kewalramani, the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program of the Takshashila Institution, with me. I'm Anushka Saxena, the host for this episode, and together we'll explore the US-China relationship marred with trade wars and a quest for technological supremacy, and examine the implications for allies and adversaries alike. And as US and India deepen their partnership in the Indo-Pacific, what could the implications of Trump's second presidency be for the balance of power in a rapidly evolving regional order? Stay with us as we unpack these developments and more, providing context, analysis, and insights into the forces shaping our world together. Let's dive in. So, Manoj, you must have watched the inauguration and the events afterward. So, why don't we kick off the episode with your insights on that? What do you make, for example, of the very prominent presence of some of the US's biggest techpreneurs like Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg at the inauguration? I mean, does the overwhelming attention given to them symbolize anything to you?
Hey, thank you so much for having me here for this conversation, Anushka. I think it does symbolize the fact that we are in a sort of different phase in American domestic policy, American democracy, and that will have implications for American foreign policy. Look, we are in an era where technology is undergoing rapid transformation, where there are certain companies which are obviously huge and which have global implications, whether it is Alphabet, whether it is Apple, whether it is Meta, obviously Elon Musk's companies, including X. They do have global significance in terms of, not just social media, in terms of reach, in terms of innovation, and in terms of sort of defining the future of what we call the information age. So I think the proximity that you're seeing between power and technology companies, and particularly under Trump, this sort of open embrace of big tech has implications globally. It has implications in terms of regulation of big tech. It has implications in terms of competition. It has implications in terms of what happens to democracies when you have consolidation of technological power in certain players, and when they also eventually wield political power. So I think that from those perspectives, there is clearly a serious sort of outcome that we are likely to see going forward. I think that we're also likely to see far more permissibility in terms of areas in which some of these companies innovate. You're likely to see fewer guardrails, as I would assume. So I think those again are things that we need to be concerned about, because you do need certain kind of regulation of technology. I mean, one doesn't need to approach new technology as a luddite, but at least you need to have certain kinds of thought process around what is the nature of regulation, where we do not end up with you know adverse outcomes for humanity. So I think that balance, which is very difficult to strike, and the balance between the power of the private firm, the power of the state, and the power of the citizen, to me, what this inauguration and the presence of all these tech CEOs symbolized was that the balance today is far more in the there's certain collusion between the state and big tech vis-a-vis the power of the citizen. So I think that to me is the biggest takeaway of those CEOs being present over there. Also, apart from the fact that Trump himself has a certain predilection towards wealth and towards wealth creators, and I think that's also a part of it. But I think the broader implication, if you think of a framework of a triangle where you have the citizen, the state, and private sector or big technology companies, I think the sort of, and if you think of power as a point in between that triangle, it's moving much more closer in the direction of both of those, state and big tech.
That's very interesting, and especially your point about striking a balance between corporate interests and accountability in governance is extremely interesting to me. Also, because under the Biden administration, if we look at the nature of regulations like the Chips and Science Act, for example, or even the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the focus with regards to government support has also sort of coerced a kind of alignment with government priorities and private enterprises in the US, right? And sometimes this isn't always in the profit interests of these private enterprises. Big ticket case study here, something that always comes to my mind is the Intel example, and how the focus of the Chips and Science Act, more than anything else, is to fuel in money for firms like Intel to move their operations out of American adversaries like China, and bring production back to domestic fields, as it were. So it could perhaps then be the case that under Trump there is some easing of this, or do you think the national security priorities of governments, and not just in the US but across the world, are really going to be the big winners in this?
Yeah, I think that the jury is out on that, right? And I'm quite hesitant to stick my neck out on whether we are likely to see a stronger national security approach. I think that we're likely to see continuation of industrial policy. There's no two ways about that. I mean, Elon Musk is the biggest government contractor in the US. We're likely to see continued industrial policy. We're likely to see continuous government spending or largesse in one way or the other. Where my concern with regard to this argument of does national security remain a top priority, I think that there is a clear division within this administration in the US. You have the people who are I wouldn't even say pro business, but there's a certain amount of, not pro market, but pro business in some ways. And they have significant self interest in keeping, in at least not letting the national security concerns adversely impact businesses, and continuing to deal with China despite the challenges, continue to deal with other countries where your primary business interests lie. And then you've got the sort of national security hawks, right? I mean, Waltz, the national security advisor, Rubio, who clearly are in some way hawkish on dealing with China in particular, but also in generally in terms of approach to national security. If you listen to what Rubio was saying through his Senate confirmation hearing and even subsequently after he took over as Secretary of State, it's a much more conventional position, if one could put it that way. So I think that you will see this tension within the administration, and sometimes it can essentially yield completely absurd outcomes, the kind that we are seeing with regard to TikTok. It is evident, it is clear that this is a national security risk from a United States perspective. There is a law that's been passed. That law has been upheld by the Supreme Court. Yet the president passes an executive order early on and says that we will not apply that law for a certain period of time. In the meantime, we continue to look for some sort of a new outcome with regard to TikTok. And you have the CEO of TikTok at the inauguration sitting next to the designate appointee for the Office of National Director. So it's there's an absurdism to all of this, right? In some ways, it's surreal and absurd. So that's why I'm not necessarily going to stick my neck out and say that yes, you're going to see a harsher national security focus. I think his position, if the TikTok case is an example, is that there is a certain amount of thought process which is about potential deal making down the road and therefore not letting the law hold. And because I do assume that you will see a deal around TikTok down the road, whether that deal is about the ownership of the company within the US, which is what the law requires, or whether that deal is that plus some opening from Beijing, or whether that deal is that nothing really happens and eventually Trump has to put his foot down and implement the law. And that leads to greater friction. So the early signs tell you that this balance between security and business is there's no straightforward answer. You're going to see a very messy outcome, and it'll be presented as smart transactionalism.
Yeah, interesting. About this deal making and TikTok, and in just this month, as 2025 kick started, there were some 3 or 4 American businessmen who were interested in buying stakes in ByteDance, in running the American operations of TikTok, and given Trump's own, as you said, uh, predilection towards deal making and business, it could very well be a possibility that this becomes true down the road and is no longer perceived a quote unquote national security threat, as it were. But if I can just move the conversation away a bit from who was there at the inauguration to who wasn't there, which was President Xi Jinping of China and Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India. And the interesting bit here is that, as you rightly mentioned, there are some very senior voices in Trump's cabinet who are hawks on China. And Trump himself has, laid down a very harsh line, including even wanting to change allies' policies and mindsets towards being hawkish on China. But at the same time, we learn from official sources that President Xi Jinping was invited to the inauguration and Prime Minister Modi wasn't. And this, again, is also a time where in the past year, even all of us at Takshashila have been making the case that the India-US relationship is really taking off and it's at one of its best points in the past 2 decades. So how pessimistically perhaps should we see this reportage in India? And an affiliated question then is, what did you make of Jaishankar's presence, his press remarks after the inauguration in this regard?
I'm not of the. I don't think that. Okay, let's roll back a little bit. It would have been truly surprising if you had seen Xi Jinping going to this inauguration. It would have been truly surprising if you had seen even the Indian Prime Minister going to this inauguration. So I'm not going to read too much into, oh, the Indian Prime Minister was not invited and Xi Jinping was invited and so on and so forth. I don't think we should read too much into it. In terms of substantively the nature of the relationship, I think that if I was to look at, you eventually had the Chinese Vice President Han Zheng attending, and you had the Indian Foreign Minister along with other Quad foreign ministers present. So I think that is a good sign that you had, and this is a unique presidency in some ways. Trump is a unique character, and so it was good to have a personal presence from the Indian perspective at the inauguration. But I don't think that the Indian Prime Minister going would have been feasible, given the level of background work that is needed into some of these things, and the fact that you need to engage in summitry, and it involves the US also having some of its other closest allies present, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we should have expected that also. So that's okay. I think as far as sort of what the early signs tell us about, the Indian foreign minister's visit to DC, he's been there for a while. He went there earlier also after the election, and now for the inauguration. It just tells you that there has been an effort by both governments and the Trump transition team soon after the victory uh, to try and maintain some degree of continuity in policy. I think it's a positive sign that Jaishankar was the first foreign minister whom Marco Rubio met. It's a positive sign. I don't see that as a, I've sort of watched some of the Indian news coverage, and I think it's fantastical in a way about the fact that he's had a front row seat, and about how he was the first minister to meet Rubio, and how that is, indicative of this special nature of the relationship. I'm not that optimistic in terms of the overall status of the India-US relationship. I think that it is a positive sign that these meetings have happened. It's also an indication of the amount of work that has gone in to maintaining some of the status of the relationship, so which tells you that none of this is inevitable, inherent. You need to do the work on these things. I'm also of the view that I think US policy with regard to India, by and large, is likely to continue to remain consistent. I think Trump's trade agenda will add some degree of friction, but it's not something that we haven't seen before. It depends on the intensity of which the trade agenda and the tariffs agenda comes to play. So far, what we have seen is that Trump has not been trigger happy with tariffs. He's taken time, which is good. On immigration, that's a sore spot right now. Clearly, the Indian side talking about how, Jaishankar was a little bit defiant on that issue of immigration. He talked about, legally repatriating people and things like that. Whereas subsequently, the Indian MEA has said that, we'll be okay to take back the people that are there. I think that is going to be a bit of a friction point. H-1B visa, I think that there are two ways to look at that. I know that at Takshashila, we've constantly looked at the H-1B program and said that, look, it's not a strategic issue from India's point of view. In fact, it's Indian talent that's going to the US, that's contributing to the US economy and technological advancement. It's great. We can have that talent here. But then the issue is from whether you can absorb that talent, and whether that talent needs to have certain degree of skills and opportunities and networks that being in the US creates, and then you can bring them back, and that brings with it a certain wealth. Along with that, of course, there's the issue of wealth generation that the NRI community does. This, Indians going abroad, them earning money and sending money back. I think the amount of this sort of wealth is about 135 billion odd on an annual basis. So that's also useful wealth, right, from an Indian point of view, that comes into the country. So I think that there are issues on that, but I don't think, again, that's a strategic issue. I think the H-1B visa issue is something that we saw the debate even before Trump was inaugurated, and Trump seemed to fall in favor of the program. And I think, given his proximity to technology billionaires, I think that program is likely to sustain. So I don't see, again, those as huge friction points. I think economic relations will be difficult. We'll have to wait and see how Trump approaches critical and emerging technologies. That was, if you see the readout between Rubio and Jaishankar, that is the first item that the American readout mentions, that was discussed. So it's a positive sign, but let's see how it evolves. Let's see what ISET does going forward. So I think that from an Indian point of view, that's how I look at it. That I think it's so far so good, no damage done. I think from a Chinese side, given the threat perception that Trump, was expected to bring with regard to China, I think they'd be a little bit more happy than India, because it's not just so far so good. It's thank God, no damage done so far, no 60% tariffs. I think that there also seems to be the TikTok example would have also given the Chinese some sense that, look, this administration is split along different lines, and we can work those different lines. So I think that Beijing right now is probably not as anxious as it was on January 17th or 16th. I think that there's a certain amount of ease, but I think the strategic direction of the relationship, Beijing realizes that is likely to be much more difficult going forward, despite whatever Trump's sort of desire for deal making would be. The last point that I add is that the indicator on India, I think we'll have to just wait and see, because we're expecting Trump to visit India this year for the Quad Leaders Summit. Let's see if that happens. Let's see if he visits.
Right. Yeah, I think just on the immigration issue, there are so many dynamics at play. It was announced that there are about 18,000 Indians who are on the verge of being deported. But then the MEA, as you mentioned, said that, okay, we're happy to accommodate them since they're illegal immigrants. And the fact of the matter is that, it's the very last stage of the American deportation process, which will probably be seen through in the coming months. But then at the same time, there's another executive order that goes a step ahead and kind of bans childbirth rights, right? And if we look at diaspora entrepreneurs coming to the US, one of their big motivations is also to have their children go to good schools, so on and so forth. I mean, that has, for example, been very true of the Taiwanese factory in Arizona, right? And birth rates have gone very much so up since the fabrication facility became operational. But then that order has been, I think, stopped by the courts and has been referred to as unconstitutional. So this is again another issue where the jury is out, and how severely problematic it could be will depend on how these things play out going forward. But
On this order of birthright citizenship and Trump wanting to revoke that, that's not a fight that I think he can win. I think that's a constitutional issue on which the rules are quite clear, the law is quite clear. So I don't think he can win that fight. And I think there is a recognition within the Trump camp that you're not going to win that fight. I think this is, you throw 100 things at the wall, knowing that some of the most egregious ones will not stick. And then it allows you the opportunity to say, hey, look, even the courts can sort of demonstrate a certain degree of independence on something which is not going to stick. So I think in terms of the broader, and it's obviously in terms of the broader immigration policy debate within the US, I don't think the birthright citizenship thing is going to end. But it's something that's telling, right, that people are like, you read these reports of people going for early C-sections just to meet the deadline. It's an absurd thing. I don't think people are thinking through the health consequences of also what they might be going through. But then not in their shoes. So.
Right. Just to come back quickly on the point you made about trade and economic issues being central to the India-US relationship going forward, do you think, and you also talked about ISET, and in under the Biden administration, we've seen some really important deals being brokered. Say, for example, the deal on jet engine co-production, and the critical component there is the transfer of know-how as opposed to just technology, right? And but at the same time, you've seen dramatically opposed regulations coming out, like the AI diffusion regulations, where India was put in a tier 2 category, which means that the US doesn't consider it a country to be important enough to either share information with or co-partner supply chain integration with. And of course, for us, defense has been the big ticket trade item. But at the same time, Trump's, like we've discussed so far, approach to stuff like this is also make America great again, buy American, sell American, so on and so forth. So do you think this competition is going to be the big challenge in enhancement of trade or enhancement of even defense partnerships going forward?
I think that there will be some friction with regard to what the agenda has. What does America first mean? Does it mean what we thought in terms of, in some ways taking manufacturing, particularly critical supply chains, and nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring? Does friendshoring still play a big role in that process? I think that is something that we'll have to see. I think more than Trump, if you listen to Rubio's Senate confirmation hearing, where he talks about, he talked about the threat from China and how there's a fear that in the next 10 years, everything that America consumes or engages in will be controlled by China. And in his policy, he didn't seem to, at least to my mind, he didn't seem to articulate anything close to friendshoring or anything about critical supply lines which are maintained with friendly states and things like that. He talked about allies and partners, but he didn't necessarily articulate something closer. Now, yes, that's in some ways that's rhetoric. I think we should wait and see what the progress in some of these plans is, whether the transfer of technology on things like the engines takes place. I think that those are things where wheels are in motion. Um, I have a feeling that you will see some of that continue to happen. Any new administration does some sort of stock taking. So there may be some time in terms of delay in terms of the progress of some of these steps, if there is stock taking that is conducted. But I do think that you will see by and large continuity in terms of policy, because you can't have something where businesses have who've made commitments, who've made investments, who've received money, uh, end up completely interrupted repeatedly. So I think that the US government is, for everything, for all the dysfunctional sort of work, I think that there is a certain amount of continuity that you will expect, particularly on some of these critical technologies and issues that have been identified. On the AI diffusion rules, I think that that is something where, as much as I'm not surprised that India is not in the tier one countries, because that is also a political signal in terms of political proximity, right? And India is obviously not an ally of the United States, right? So I think that there is, it's not surprising that that's not happened. India is also not at the technological forefront like some of these other partners that they've announced as part of the tier one. So I'm not surprised that that's the case. I think it is good that India is not in the countries where you don't want, where the Americans do not want to engage with. It's not a hostile country, and I think that that's recognized, and it's part of sort of the rest of the world. And to me, that's somewhere the price that you pay for strategic autonomy. The fear, of course, is that you end up with these unilateral policy clubs that are being created, groupings. These end up ossifying into some sort of formal groupings which create technology denial regimes. And I think that that's a legitimate concern from an Indian point of view, particularly given our experience of technology denial over the decades. I think what needs to be therefore done is a lot of backroom diplomacy where you carve out legal exceptions for India. It's not something that Indian diplomats and policymakers are new to. We've done this in the past. Um, but if it's the price you pay for autonomy, that there will be additional hoops that you will have to jump. Um, does that create? And I think it's useful for Washington to also understand that doing so does create does create a certain loss of public trust within the relationship. So yes, I think Washington should hear that frustration from an Indian perspective. But I think from an Indian point of view, I'm also a bit of a realist, where I understand that yes, these are hoops that you might have to jump through. It's a signal. It's emblematic of the fact that you don't still have enough power, right? So you still need to continue to cultivate power and not count your chickens before they've hatched.
Very interesting. And Manoj, at this point, I'll just have one final question to you. We spoke of trust and creation of denial regimes, technology denial regimes based on partnership and alliances. And I'd just like to focus on that one point for your final answer. The precedent of or the precedent of Trump's first presidency indicates that he's been very harsh with so-called alliances, and there's a lot of wrangling then about the lack of a partnership as opposed to what Trump would like, which is dictating the rules of the game. And a lot of things are then on the line here. So, if we can just take the case study of the Philippines, for example, can it trust the US to follow through under a Trump presidency if, for example, at some point it chooses to invoke the mutual defense treaty against China? Or can the EU trust the US with helping it out with fossil fuel requirements in case the sanctions run deeper, so on and so forth? So what perhaps would your takeaway be, or your opinion be, on what these very important American allies should do or should look out for with this second presidency?
I think the one thing that was clear, not just with the first Trump presidency, but even before that, is that US allies need to start thinking, allies, partners need to start cultivating their own national power. That doesn't mean that you need to become entirely Atmanirbhar, but you need to bring more to the table. Um, and in some ways, they have made an effort, right? So there has been increase in defense spending. In terms of energy, Germany has built new LNG terminals. So you've done a lot more than you did in the past. And there is a recognition that there is a lot more that you need to do in terms of building national power and capacity. You need to also build more sort of issue based coalitions around different areas. And that's what you've seen, whether it's France, whether it's Germany, whether it's the UK, in terms of their engagement in the Indo Pacific. So, from a European point of view, it's a search for relevance and it's a search for power and capacity, which I think continues. There's also the threat of what a Trump victory and what, say, the new right in the US, which is tech enabled in some way now, what that means for domestic politics within European countries. And I think to me, that is the far bigger threat than, and yes, trade and other issues will feed into that threat. But to me, that's the big challenge. So what you need to do is you need to deliver and you need to continue to invest in your capacity. Um, It'll also mean that you need to continue to maintain uh, a very difficult balance between the US and China. You can't alienate either. And I think that that is something that will continue. I think in terms of East Asian countries, whether it is Philippines, whether it is Japan, the answer is sort of the same thing, right? If the Philippines, the escalation between China and the Philippines over the last year, year and a half, did see opportunities where the mutual defense treaty could have been invoked. But it told us that neither side, even the Biden administration, really didn't want to invoke it. So I think the threshold for that is quite high. I think that it'll have to, so there'll have to be something substantive for that treaty to be invoked, and I think that will be a real test to see if the United States agrees with the invocation of that treaty. So my sense is that with Trump, that bar will get even higher. Because I don't think the U.S. fundamentally wants to get involved in conflict with China in any part of the world at present. I don't think it wants to. So my sense is that these countries will quickly realize that they probably need to also focus much more on their own domestic capacity. I don't think the US interest in terms of, I don't think the US is interested even under Trump to walk back any of these treaty commitments, because I think Trump also recognizes that these are tools of power and you don't want to let them go, because they also give you visibility in the region, right? Which is useful to deal with China, even if you want to transact with them. You don't give away your chips when you're doing transactions. So I don't think he will want to give that away. But my sense is the Chinese will want to test to see how far does Trump want to push and how far they can push Trump. So you're likely to see much more interesting engagements with the Chinese in East Asia. The final piece of this puzzle is the war in Ukraine. I think what early indications tell us is that there is some sort of backroom engagement that's taking place between the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans on this. And the Chinese seem to be quite satisfied with the direction within which this is moving. So I think that that would be, to me, an early indication, not just from a European security perspective and Trump's engagement with his allies in Europe, but also from what a deal on Ukraine can mean for the Indo-Pacific and some sort of American accommodation of Chinese aspirations in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's what I would look for. What are the sort of implications of that deal for this region, and therefore for ties with India? It's therefore not surprising that you're seeing countries like India, Australia, Japan. As much as we had the Quad meeting, foreign ministers meeting, India, Australia, and Japan are also easing ties with China, and so is China easing with them. You just had, I mean, India. We've spoken about the deal in October, and subsequently we'll be having the Indian Foreign Secretary visiting China soon. At the same time, you had after 6.5, 7 years, you had a Japanese political delegation, ruling party delegation visiting China, agreeing to continuing dialogue across key issues. You have a PLA delegation visiting Japan right now. So you're seeing some sort of new dynamics also emerging there, right? Important tactical changes within the broader landscape of geopolitical competition between China and the United States, but also an effect of Trump.
Very fair, and it's a great kind of concluding note to leave this episode with, which is about thinking through the implications for India and the potential ushering in of a new regional order where China is surprisingly going to be more moderate. At least that's what, as you said, the early signs tell us, or maybe more empowered, depending on how Trump shapes his foreign policy going forward. And I think the big takeaway from this final answer of yours was also about looking inward and developing our own capabilities, because this is again a very crucial bit of the India China US triangle, right? Even India has in the past couple years found some solace in having American support and having that mutual threat perception lens, that shared lens, which may not be the same going forward. So thank you so much for that, Manoj. A really interesting conversation. And also thank you to our listeners for joining us as we untangled the threads of power, policy, and partnerships shaping our world. Until next time, thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.